How's it going, guys? I'm going to be doing a transmission and clutch change today, so I'm hoping I can get a decent video out of it for people who need a little bit more in-depth than what's on the internet. So the last time I did this, I found it was a lot easier to remove as much from up here before you raise the car up, because it just makes it that much easier rather than having to go above the car, below the car, everything like that. So let's get started. The first thing you want to remove is the air box. There's a 10mm or Phillips screwdriver or screw here and here. So after you remove these or loosen these two hose clamps, there's two hoses right here that need to come out. And then the whole thing just removes like that. Next, usually what you would do is you would pop the top off of the air filter and then unclamp this and take it off. Then there's a bolt nut here, a bolt there, and another bolt in back. And then there's a hose down here that runs to the side for the cooler air. But it's just that easy. After you remove the air box, the next thing you want to do is remove the battery, which is a nut here and a nut here, and I believe they are both 10mm. Okay, so when you remove the battery, don't forget to put it on like a piece of wood or a cinder block or something that is non-conductive so that your battery doesn't ground out. Pretty much it's just going to be dead when you go to put it back in the car, so make sure you do that. Next, you remove the battery tray, and it's not bolted down or anything, so it's super easy. Next, you want to remove this battery tray that actually holds up the battery, and there is I believe it's a 14mm bolt here and a 14mm bolt right here. For the battery tray, there are two 12mm bolts that go right into the side right here and right down here. And then there's a little metal tab that goes into the coolant overflow, and then it comes right out. Next, what I'm going to do is remove the slave cylinder, which is attached to the transmission by two 12mm bolts right here and right here. And then I'm going to move it out of the way because I have a stainless steel clutch line, flexible, don't gotta worry about pinching the hard lines anywhere. I highly suggest it. Alright, so I'm going to tuck this away right up here. That way the line's out of the way, don't gotta worry about it. Okay, next I'm going to remove any connectors that are connected to the transmission, like right here, down at the bottom. Okay, next connector is right under here, under this plastic covering all the wiring. Next, what I'm going to do is remove the shift linkage cables from the transmission by popping these pins out. You just pull up on that side, pull it straight out, and the same with this one. And then they pop off just like that. Next, I'm going to remove the three 12mm bolts, one right here, one's underneath this cable that you have to kind of move out of the way in order to get to, right here, and then there's another one right up here under this cable. Now with that bracket removed, you can get to this sensor right here. Don't forget to disconnect your ground wire that's right here and connects to the frame right here. It's a 10mm bolt. Okay, next we're going to go underneath the car, so jack the car up. That's a problem. I'm too low for the scissor jack. Got a 2x4 under the tire. Now we're good to go. For this, I have a 24mm. Fits right over it. Now that you have the jack stands underneath the car, you can go ahead and take off the wheels. Now that we have the wheel off, we're going to come right down here and remove these three to separate the lower control arm from the wheel hub. They're 3 17mm. Okay, next I'm going to come right up here above the lower control arm and remove this 17mm bolt. Okay, so after we remove the bolts for the lower control arm, we're going to come up front on each corner and remove the 17mm bolt, a 17mm bolt right there, and then go to the other side, remove that 17mm bolt, and then up front that 17mm bolt. Make sure you put a jack underneath the rear end of the subframe so that when you remove the engine mounts, it doesn't pull the power steering rack and pull your alignment out of place. Okay, now we're going to come back here to the rear motor mount and remove this 19mm bolt. Next, we'll come up here to the front motor mount and remove this 17mm bolt. And be careful when you remove that bolt, because when you do, it's going to release the front end of the subframe. Okay, so I lowered the rear of the subframe with the jack just enough to get access to these bolts for the power steering rack. This one is a 17mm, this one is a 14mm. You take the 17mm out and loosen up the 14mm just enough to get this bracket out of the way. Okay, so for the passenger side, it's a little different. There's a 14mm bolt right here, right where these wires are, underneath it, and on the opposite side of this boot, there's another one behind it. Okay, so on the driver's side, there are 2 more bolts right there, holding the subframe to the power steering rack, and it's just like this bracket over here. You just want to unbolt the one connected to the power steering rack and loosen the other bolt just enough to swing the bracket out of the way. Now the last thing to do before dropping the subframe is make sure these clips right here and right here come out of the bracket on the subframe. Okay, so for this part, I would tie up your power steering rack. I have a tow strap wrapped around the power steering rack, goes up behind the engine, comes up over the engine, and hooks to my bumper. To drop the subframe completely, there's still this hanger right here. You just disconnect that now, and the whole thing should fall down. Now I'm going to start taking off the bolts that hold the transfer case to the engine, and in order to get this bolt back here, you have to take off this front engine mount, which is 3 17mm. Also, before you start taking out any bolts, make sure your engine is supported by a jack or a jack stand, and never have the jack directly on the oil pan, because you can crack your oil pan. Always have some thick cardboard or like a block of wood to take some of that. Before we start separating the engine from the transmission, go ahead and take a pry bar and pop the axles out of the differential. To remove the passenger side axle, you have to remove this heat shield above the half shaft. There's a 12mm bolt right up here. Right up here. And then a 12mm bolt right there. And then a 12mm bolt right back here. Alright, once we remove that shield, you're going to remove this bracket right here, which is a 14mm here, 14mm here, and a 14mm. So now I'm just taking a crowbar or a pry bar and peeling this out of the transmission. Okay, so now with the axle out, I can access this 17mm and this 17mm that connects the engine to the transmission. Okay, so now that we're underneath the transmission, there's usually a plate that goes right here with a 10mm bolt here and a 10mm bolt here. And with that out of the way, I'm going to remove this 14mm bolt right here and this 14mm bolt right here. Okay, coming up to the front of the transmission underneath, there's a 17mm bolt right here. Now coming up further in the front, next to the starter, one of the starter bolts, this one specifically, is a 17mm, and that holds the engine to the transfer case. There's two more 17mm bolts that are kind of hard to see up top. One is right down in here. You can see it right there. And the other one is right down there. Okay, there are 3 bolts holding the transmission to the transmission mount. There's this 17mm right here. There's a 17mm right here. And then there's one that you can only get with a crescent wrench. I've tried with a socket wrench, and it is right there. Alright, after you have the 17mm bolts and nuts off, you have to move your ECU out of the way, which is a 14mm bolt right here, so that you can get to the bolts on the other side of the transmission mount. Now that that 14mm bolt right there is out of the way, I moved my ECU up and out of the way so that I can get to that 10mm right there, which will allow me access to that bolt and that bolt. And with that 10mm removed, I was able to take that plate off and go up here to the 14mm and spin the bracket for the ECU out of the way and access those two 17mm. There's another 17mm bolt right there. Okay, and now that all the bolts are out and the transmission mount is off, you should just be able to wiggle it free. One thing that I forgot is right there, the bracket for the airbox has to be taken off, because that's the only thing holding it in right now, and it's hitting up against the frame. There are 3 10mm bolts holding in the airbox. Wow, this is not something you want to see when you drop your transmission. That is a mess. My clutch pretty much exploded inside here. Okay, so to remove this pressure plate, there are some 10mm stars. 12-point star, you have to have that specific socket, otherwise you can't get it off.